Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey friend, welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am here today solo to bring you a conversation about something that I am passionate about and that I see a real challenge right now happening in the leadership world. So I'm going to be talking about two sides of the same coin. So lately I have seen and heard a lot of talk about the issues and the problems that are happening in the church. And clearly there are issues and there are challenges. We talked about some of that in last week's episode with Nikki Koziars. So it could be anything from false teaching to abuse issues to unhealthy environments, so many things that are concerning that are happening within the church. And we know that as a whole, the Western church, the part of the world that I live in, we don't have it all figured out. I don't think anyone really does. But we know that there are some big issues that need to be addressed. But sometimes when I hear about these issues and these challenges and the fact that, things need to change, the recommended approach for how to bring the concerns to leaders is quite problematic. And then on the other hand, I know of situations and I've heard stories where someone who is a member of a church or an organization does attempt to bring a concern, and they do so in a healthy way, and they're met with less than positive responses. The leader might become angry or defensive, or maybe they will hear the concern and then respond passive aggressively. So there's a lot of things going on when it comes to how we communicate and how we address concerns in our organizations, in our churches, and in our workplaces. So I am really passionate about communication and how we as leaders can communicate with one another as Christians, as well as Christians communicating with people who are not believers. And because I have been in both roles, both as someone who has a concern that I need to bring to a leader, and I've been on the receiving end of having concerns brought to me or feedback brought to me, I want to share some thoughts with you in the next two episodes, the next two solo episodes, I should say, about how we can get to a place of having a healthier and more productive process for this. So in this episode today, I'm going to talk to you about how you can bring a concern to a leader, and just give you some thoughts around a way to do this that is more likely to get a positive response. And then in my next solo episode that I do, I'm going to talk about when you are on the receiving end of having concerns or feedback brought to you and how you can manage that and handle that as a leader. All right. So I would love to just say, if you find these episodes helpful, or this podcast helpful in general, I would love for you to consider taking a screenshot and sharing it on social media. When you spread the word, it helps more women who want to grow in their leadership know about the podcast. And so you can go ahead and share it on your Instagram stories tag me when you do, so I'm sure to see it and I can definitely reshare it as well. So I'd love to see some of those screenshots and your takeaways from the podcast coming through in the next week. That would be super fun. All right, so let's dive in to how to bring a concern to a leader. Okay, I'm going to start with a story of what not to do. So in a past job that I had, a situation came up where my leader did something that upset me. I felt undermined and I felt like my work was not appreciated. And I received a message in my inbox that was about this issue, and it really got me upset. I responded to the email right away. That was the first mistake I made. And it was clear that I was not happy about the situation. I don't believe I said very much, but I know that my leader knew that I was not happy. And then a few minutes later, my phone rang. And I knew that I was not in a good place to talk. I knew that my emotions were high and I was really upset. But I picked up the phone anyway. And I proceeded to unload all of my feelings, all of my concerns, all at once on this phone call. Let's just say this was not my finest moment. After that phone call, I was sure that I was going to be released from that role and not continuing in the role that I had at that time. However, thankfully, there was grace, there was forgiveness, there was a calmer conversation that took place later to address the issues that were bothering me. But I can tell you this, that approach that I took was not an effective or useful way to bring my concerns to my leader. In fact, it was the opposite of that. And I definitely let my, sinful flesh win out in that situation. So what I want to share about today is not from a place of having it all figured out or never having made mistakes in this area. In fact, it's more from the place of I have made some significant mistakes and here's what I've learned and here's what I would love to see you be able to do and learn from my mistakes moving forward as you may need to bring concerns to your own leader. So before we dive into the process that I'm going to share, I want to say that there are a lot of different scenarios in which you might need to bring feedback or concern to a leader. In some cases, like it was with mine, it might be that you have an immediate issue that directly impacts your work or your relationship. You could be an employee or a team member, and the concern might be related to your work environment, the team atmosphere, again, the relationships on the team, or the actual, work that you're doing. And then other times it could be more of a situation where you're attending a church and the pastor might preach on a topic and share something that feels a little iffy to you or a little questionable, or you don't agree with it. And in those situations, you're not actually an employee or a staff. You might not even be, on a serve team or a leadership team, but you're a participant in that church and you have concerns about something that was brought up. Similarly to what Holly shared about in our 3-year anniversary episode, she shared about a time where she had a concern about a message that a pastor gave, and she attempted to speak to him, and she shared what happened with that. So I'm going to share the fact that when I thought of the idea of doing this episode, I was really thinking about that second situation, more of the situation of when you are a member of a group at a church or a workplace situation where you hear a leader, but particularly I'm thinking in the faith community, share something or you see them do something that is questionable to you or that you don't agree with and you have concerns about. So what do you do in that situation? I think what I'll share today will be helpful in both of the scenarios that I just gave, whether you are actually an employee or a team member, or you're more of a member, a participant of the community. So I'm going to dive into 4 steps to be able to bring a concern to a leader. This is not a guaranteed process. It doesn't mean that if you do these 4 things that you're going to get a positive outcome. But it is something that I think the process that I'm going to share, I think will be helpful for you in increasing the likelihood that the leader who is on the receiving end of your concern and your feedback, it's probably going to increase the chances that they will be able to receive it in a positive way. Okay, so step 1 is assess the need for the conversation. The first thing I want you to do before you jump in to having the conversation like I did when I shouldn't have picked up the phone is first ask yourself, do I need to address this issue with my leader? Do I need to bring this to their attention? In the situation in the story that I shared, I did need to bring my concerns to my leader, but the way I did it and the timing of how I did it was not the right choice. So in the situation where maybe you are attending a church and the pastor preaches something that you don't agree with or that you have questions about, you can kind of step back and ask yourself, is this a big enough issue or a concerning enough situation that I really want to talk to the leader about it? Consider, does this relate to core issues, core doctrines of the faith, or is it more of a secondary issue? Now, I'm not saying that if it's a secondary issue, it doesn't mean that you don't bring it up. I just want you to evaluate the level of severity of the concern that you have. Just as an example, this is not a real situation that happened, but just as an example, if my pastor discusses and preaches a message on women in leadership, if he said something that I disagreed with in that message, then I may or may not need to go to him to discuss it. I really need to consider how important is it to me and how vital is this stance on his role as my pastor or whatever the case might be. Okay. But if, for example, he preached about Easter and, on an Easter Sunday, and he shared about the resurrection of Christ, and he made a statement that implied that, maybe the resurrection wasn't a literal event, well, then I'm probably going to be more concerned and have more of a reason to speak up and to talk with him. Okay. So I'm not giving you a guideline on if it's this, you do need to say it. And if it's this, you don't. I just want you to take a minute and check in with yourself and find out how important is this issue to you. You can also consider, is this a matter of personal conviction versus is it truly a biblical, scriptural mandate? And so sometimes there are things that fall more under the personal conviction realm. And Paul even talks about this in the New Testament, where there's certain things where somebody might say, hey, it's okay to do this. And others might say, you know what? It's not okay to do this. And that is more of a personal conviction versus a mandate from scripture that tells us, how to live in walking in humility and speaking, having gracious speech and things like that. So there's more about that, about the issue of personal conviction versus mandates in episode 112, if you want to check that out. Okay, so you're going to do a check with yourself and evaluate if you need to speak up. Now, there's one more thing that I want to kind of mention about this that is really important, and it's this. Silence is not the answer in many cases. So unfortunately, there are times when people stay silent in leadership situations or as a follower or a member of a church because we have concerns about the fallout, about what happens if we speak up, the repercussions if we talk to our employer about a particular situation. And this is a real concern, especially again, if you are about to go to your employer or you are in a role where the leader could have some kind of way of punishing you for speaking up. So I just want to acknowledge that is a real issue. But I also want to say that if it is a matter of someone has broken the law or done something unethical, or there is sin involved in this particular concern that you have, then it is really vital that you speak up, even if you are taking a risk in doing so. And there's 2 episodes I want to reference that we've had conversations around this before. One is with Sharon Hottie Miller. She shared this idea. We talked about the fact that sometimes as leaders, we conceal things because we think that we need to protect the reputation of Jesus or of our churches. But she points out this statement: what stands in the way of people coming to the church or to Jesus if we are more concerned with the church's reputation than with people's freedom and safety? So really, she was pointing out the fact that we need to be willing to speak up even when our reputation as a church or as leaders might be at stake. And then in episode 121 with Tara Matson, she shares about the importance of speaking up even when it's risky. So I will have the link to both of those episodes in the show notes so that you can check those out and take a listen. Okay, so let's assume now that you have evaluated and assessed the need for the conversation and you've decided, yes, I do need to talk to my leader. This is something that I am concerned about. And I'm talking the next few steps that I'm going to share. I'm going to be speaking more about a general concern that you have and not specifically about something major like a law has been broken or there's a serious moral failure. That's a different scenario that I'm not kind of addressing right now. Okay. So let's go to step 2. Step 2 is going to be to share your concerns with curiosity rather than accusations. Okay. So this is where I see some of this common advice that I hear on podcasts and online. It goes sideways because I often hear people say, something like, if you hear your pastor preaching something that doesn't align with scripture, go to him and tell him why you're concerned and bring these resources and give him information and make sure he knows why the thing is wrong. Okay. And I get it. I get that we are concerned about false teaching and about things that might be taking people astray. I also hear people talking about if you follow someone online and they talk about X issue, then unfollow them, right? And that's like the solution is just unfollow them, cut them off. There's nothing you can learn from them if they disagree with you on one particular point. But here's the problem. That approach really carries an attitude of self-righteousness. An attitude that indicates that you have the monopoly on the truth or the right perspective on this issue. And your leader or the person you follow needs to be educated on why they are wrong, or simply you cut them off and you're not going to be able to take anything good from them anymore. So here's what I want to propose. Instead of going to your leader with this attitude and saying, here's the thing I'm concerned about. This is the reason I'm concerned about it. Here are the resources that you need to read. Here's what you need to do to change. I think we will be better served and it will probably be much more effective if we go in with an attitude of humility and curiosity. So something more like, hey, you know what? I really appreciate what you do. I appreciate the sacrifices that you make to lead our church, or, I appreciate what you share online. And I love being part of your community or your church or whatever it is that they lead. And then say something like, hey, you know what? Recently you shared about something and I had some questions about it. And I would really love to learn more and understand your perspective a little bit better because I wasn't quite clear on where you stand. So if you think about it, if you're on the receiving end of one of those two kind of approaches, which one is going to land better with you? It's probably going to be the second approach, right? So once you come in with humility, you can share what your concerns are and be specific about what those concerns are. You could share examples of what the person said or did that was concerning to you. And make sure you don't use blaming language or accuse them of just being an awful leader or making poor decisions. And then simply ask, would you be willing to share your perspective on these issues? Okay, or something like that. Then we go to step 3. Be open to hearing your leader's response. This is the real sticking point, right? We have to actually be willing to listen and hear their reply to our concerns. This is where that there's a saying that there's some question on who actually said it originally or where it originated. But the concept is seeking first to understand before being understood. And so if you go in seeking to understand, that means you need to listen in order to understand their perspective. So your leader, once you bring this question or this concern, they may or may not have an immediate response. They might need to have time to process the concerns and the thoughts that you brought and formulate a reply. Or they might be able to share the reply right then and there. And again, this could be happening in person. This could be happening on a phone call. It could be via email, although email is my least favorite way to deal with these kinds of things. There may be times that that's the only option. But whatever the case is, be willing to step back and wait for their response and then listen to the response. And you might need to ask more questions as needed, but again, doing so in a way that is curious, that is ready to engage them and seeking to understand with that attitude, rather than with an attitude of trying to prove them wrong or trying to make sure that they know that you're right about this issue. Oftentimes, the leader has already thought about a lot of the concerns that you're bringing up. They may have done research, they may have read or heard different perspectives, and they may just need a chance to share that. And so make sure that you're not making assumptions about what they do or do not know about the thing that you're bringing to their attention. All right, so I'm going to share a little brief blurb about one of the hot topics right now and kind of a scenario that I've seen play out. Earlier on during the pandemic, so if we go back to spring of 2020, when the whole world was kind of reeling in this crisis of COVID-19 and having to navigate these unknown waters of masks and whether or not we could gather and all of those questions. At our church, our leadership team had been meeting regularly. Our pastors and elders were discussing the next steps and weighing all the recommendations and considering what were the right choices and praying and, looking at the practical and spiritual needs of the church. And so, like happened in many other churches, I know that we're not alone in this. When a decision was shared about, maybe what was going to be happening over the coming months or weeks, sometimes there would be people who would speak up about the decision and disagree with it. But unfortunately, sometimes people would do this in a way that would basically just accuse the leaders of making a bad decision and not caring about people or not caring about science or not caring about the spiritual needs. It was always a different perspective, but these concerns could be brought up in a way that would assume that none of those things happened, like the prayer and the processing and the considering of all the different things at hand that were concerns. So here's the thing. It's not wrong for each of us to have our opinion and our perspective on how things are handled or how certain topics are discussed at church, etc. But how we approach it and how we bring these concerns up is super important. And the challenge is that in some of those scenarios, the person didn't attempt to have a conversation or reach out for clarification before they voiced their opinion about what was right or wrong about the decision. And so I just want to say, you know what? Let's make sure we stop, ask the person the leader for their perspective. How did you come to this decision? I think that's a perfectly good question to ask. How did you come to this decision? Could you share more about your perspective? And then, maybe if you still have something that you are concerned about, saying, are you willing to hear my perspective on this as well? And why I feel that this maybe misses the mark. Again, there's a very different approach to that versus telling someone that they have made the wrong decision and not taking into account what may have gone on behind closed doors that you're not aware of. So the last thing I want to say when you are in this part of hearing your leader's response is clarifying anything that isn't clear. So you can ask questions to clarify. So something like, what I'm hearing you say is ... basically share what you heard them say. And then, is this correct or did I miss anything in your perspective? And so again, giving them a chance to correct any misinterpretation that you might have had in hearing what they said. All right, let's go to the last step of this process, and that is evaluate and determine your next steps. So after you've had the conversation or the email exchange or the phone call, whatever it was, you're going to need to consider what your leader shared and determine how you want to proceed. So was your leader open and receptive to the conversation? Did he or she hear your concerns? Did they provide a response to your concerns, or did they brush it off? In some situations, you might be satisfied with the answers and you may be willing to just move on and accept what they shared. It may have given you clarity and a deeper understanding of where they stand and why they stand in that position. And I want to just throw in a reminder here that we do not have to agree on everything to be under someone's leadership or to be in community with someone else. It's okay if you disagree with your leader, as long as that disagreement doesn't create a level of tension that you are not able to live with. Okay? In some cases, though, you may be at a point where you realize this perspective or this disagreement is not acceptable for me, and I can't stay under this person's leadership. Okay? Maybe the leader exploded when you shared your concerns and they reacted in a really poor way, and you've attempted to, handle that, but there isn't a resolution. There are some times when we do need to be willing to move on. There's been times that I have attempted to bring a concern to a leader. In one case in particular, I attempted a couple times to bring a concern to a former employer. And after a couple unsuccessful attempts of having a rational conversation, I had to choose my mental health. I had to prioritize my mental health, and I had to leave that situation. So in some cases, there may be a need to leave. And again, sometimes it may be an issue of theology. If we're talking in the church world, there may be a theological disagreement, and you may have to make the choice to step away and look for a different church. But I really think that a lot of times it's really vital to at least attempt a conversation before making that decision. And also to really weigh the level of disagreement that there is here, and whether that means it's a place that you can continue to worship or to be under the leadership or not. In the episode with Katie Cole, back in episode 60, we talked about the issue of, women in leadership, and she talked about the varying stances churches might take theologically on that issue. And we talked about what to do if you disagree with your church's stance. And this is what she said. She said, if you disagree with the theology, you do need to leave the church unless you can set aside your beliefs for the sake of the kingdom because you've been called to that church. And then she said, if you agree with the theology, but you disagree with the culture, then this is a place to lead the change. Step into what God has given you and show up. So I just love that perspective from Katie, because She kind of reminds us that there's a difference between theology and culture, and that sometimes the theological perspective of your church may be different than what's playing out in culture. And again, when you're considering your decision on staying or leaving in any scenario, you want to make sure that you are praying and considering, has God called you to this place or not? And there may be times that we stay somewhere because we believe we're called there and we're called to help, produce change. And other times it may be something where we don't see an opportunity for change to take place and we disagree with what the leader has done or said to a level that we feel we can't continue to be in that place. All right. This is the 4-step process that I wanted to share with you today. Again, just to recap, step 1 is to assess the need for the conversation. Step 2 is to share your concerns with curiosity rather than accusations. Step 3 is to be open to hearing your leader's response. And step 4 is to evaluate and determine your next steps and consider, whether or not the concern that you had, that you brought to your leader is worth leaving, or if you're okay with staying. Again, if it turns out that you disagree on that particular issue or point. All right. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I know that there are times that we all have situations where we have someone we're following that says something that we are concerned about, or we have a leader at our workplace or a leader in our church world where there may be something concerning. And I hope that you can take these steps and consider how you might be able to approach your leader in a more positive way than maybe what I did with my story that I shared earlier. And, I hope and pray that it will bring a positive result. Now, I do want to share that I have a mini course called Confident Conversations, and that is the sponsor for today's episode. So Confident Conversations will actually help you to navigate those kind of difficult conversations with more confidence. And it will provide you with some resources to walk through a process of, again, evaluating whether you need to have the conversation. And I go into more specifics on how to actually approach and schedule the conversation, and then even some scripts on exactly what to say in those conversations. And that's going to apply to not just when you're bringing a concern to a leader, but lots of other types of hard conversations. So if you want to check that out, you can go to confidentconversations.com and check out if that resource would be useful for you. All right, friend. Thank you so much for being here today for this episode. Remember that in the next solo episode that I do, which will probably be sometime in the next month or so, I will share with you kind of part 2 of this conversation, which is more around what to do when someone brings a concern to you. If you are a leader and someone comes to you with a concern, we're going to talk about how to handle that and how to navigate that type of challenging situation. All right, friend, thank you again for being here with me on today's episode. I look forward to seeing you share and tag me on social media so that I can hear your feedback and your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.